Looking now at this new study that we're starting in Ezekiel, this fellow Ezekiel was a guy who prophesied during some of the darkest moments in the history of Israel, and that had to do with the 70-year captivity time in Babylon, when basically the Hebrew nation was taken away as prisoners and slaves into Babylon. And the destruction of Jerusalem followed that. The interesting things about all of this is that Ezekiel was going to be just a priest. He was like one of the guys. That was how he was raised. His upbringing was putting him in a position to where he could have been a priest in the temple for the Hebrew nation. But things changed a little bit when we get into this time frame in his life. The name Ezekiel itself in Hebrew means God strengthens. God strengthens. And it's appropriate for him because as a priest who now is going to be serving as a prophet, he's going to need all the strength that God can offer him to be a spokesman to the Jewish exiles in Babylon and in future times as he continued to give them all of this information to basically rebuke them because of their sinful lives. That was one of the reasons they were in captivity in Babylon, is because they basically just told God, we don't need you, blah, blah, blah. And he says, okay, fine, I don't need you either. And Nebuchadnezzar comes along and takes them all up to Babylon, modern-day Iraq. He was 30 years old at that time. Now, it came about in the 30th year of the 5th day of the 4th month while I was by the river Kebar among the exiles. The heavens were open and I saw visions of God. He was 30. That was the age that typically would have allowed him to be ordained into the priesthood. He was all ready to go to begin his ministry on behalf of Yahweh, because he was a man of faith. And it would have been so easy for him to just be a priest. You'd follow the rules, you go through what Deuteronomy and Leviticus tells you to do as a priest, and it's thus and so and thus and so, and you go to bed at night and you get up in the morning and do it all over again. Life is good. But that's not what happened to him. When we see this young man now accepting this different call, we have a real picture here. In Numbers 4, 1-3, we see that when the Lord talked to Moses and his brother Aaron, he said that he wanted a census taken for all the descendants of Kohath from among the sons of Levi. The Levites were set aside as the priestly sect of all of the Hebrew people. They were, one of the 12 tribes, and God said, these are the ones that are going to be special. They're going to take care of everything that's going to be in the future for the temple, and that includes the ones that were alive then, and then all of those family members that would follow. All the male family members would be the Levitical priests, and that has carried on today. There are Levitical priest remnants in Jerusalem right now that claim the bloodline of Levi. So from 30 years and upward, that's the age. 30 years up to about 50, that's when they could start service as a priest. But the key thing about the prophets, he's getting this call, and he's going to become a prophet. You have to be careful because prophets were usually despised. Usually they were despised. And they were persecuted because people didn't like to hear what they were being told. Most of the time, they received their messages and their orders from the Lord, and they presented them regardless of what the content was. Imagine a prophet coming up to you and saying, the Lord told me that you're the scourge of the earth, you're the worst person that's ever walked. I'll show you, Me and my family are going to take it out on you, prophet. Not you, Greg, but, It's part of what made all of this so difficult. It was dangerous to be a prophet because so often you had a bounty, if you can imagine. We got 400 shekels if you'll take out this prophet. We don't like what he's saying. And the same thing was going on because in his time period, Jeremiah was right there with him in exile. And in that same time frame, which would have been like 592 to 570 BC, that 22 years, they prophesied together. And in the reality, when God promised to restore the people if they would repent of their sins, this is what Jeremiah and in this case Ezekiel were charged with impressing upon the people. They had a lot that they had to take into consideration when they expressed all this stuff. Jeremiah 5:30, an appalling and horrible thing has happened in this land. This is him talking to the people. Okay? He's prophesying right now. This is what God tells him to say. The prophets prophesy falsely. Whoa, what? And the priests rule on their own authority, and my people love it so, but what will you do at the end of it? The message which Jeremiah commanded Seraiah, the son of Neriah, the grandson of Mahisiah, when he went with Zedekiah, the king of Judah, to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. Seraiah was a quartermaster. He was in charge of food and everything. So Jeremiah wrote in a single scroll all the calamity which would come upon Babylon. In other words, these words that were being expressed by Jeremiah were basically going to be duplicated, and you'll see in future text, by what was going on at the time of Ezekiel's prophecy. He's going to be telling them the same types of things. Guess what, guys? When you return to your land, it's going to be hard times. It's going to be bad. When they're out of exile, they're going to have super troubles because this calamity is going to come upon Babylon, and it's going to make everything concerning Babylon basically happen to you. And history tells us eventually that Babylon was conquered by the Persians and destroyed. And the same thing happens in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is conquered by Babylon and destroyed. Now you've got the same thing going on in two different types of people. And when we continue on with this, Jeremiah's prophecy said, "These are the words of the letter which Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the rest of the elders of the exile, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." In other words, you think it's tough now? It's not going to get any easier. And this whole thing points back to the fact that the prophet's hardest task was to change people's minds. To change people's minds. When we stop and think about all of the false teaching that was going on, this was the real problem that was addressed here by Jeremiah, that the prophets are giving false prophecies. These were prophets that were in it for the money. These were the guys that came along and they figured out that, if I do this right, they'll reward me. I always fall back to my description of the pastor in Los Angeles, South Los Angeles, who has a Rolls Royce for every day of the week and a spare just in case one of them doesn't run right. A pastor. Okay. I got 2 Mustangs, but together they're not worth one Rolls Royce. And these people were hearing this stuff that's all good news. These fake prophets are telling them things that aren't going to happen. And they love what they're saying. Someone like Ezekiel comes along and says something negative, and it's like, off with his head. We don't need you. We like the other guy. And we like those priests too, because they say we don't have to do all this stuff. We can do whatever we want to do. And before you know it, you've got a whole society here in exile in Babylon that the Word of God, truthfully coming down through a real prophet, means nothing. And 2 Corinthians 10, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. The destruction of fortresses is a word play that has to do with killing false teaching. These fortresses, the way the Greek is written here, has to do with people believing everything they hear. We could equate it to, dare I say, ABC, NBC, CBS. Everything we hear, we believe. And that's what was going on here. These people were hearing all of this stuff. And Paul, in this case, to the church at Corinth, was saying, hey, you got these false teachers coming in, and you just can't be accepting this stuff. They're worshiping this small g God and saying that that's okay with the big G God. Verse 5, we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. In other words, all these things that the people believe are true, they present it to Christ and recognize the fact that it's antithetical. It's a total opposite of what Jesus would teach. Do not steal. It's okay to borrow. Do not kill. Well, it's okay to get even. This is the kind of stuff that's going on, and the people are accepting of it. Verse 6, and we are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete. In other words, people in the church in Corinth that were receiving all this and propagating it and spreading it around, they've got some dues to pay. And thus, so says Paul, we're ready to punish. And when we look now at the reality of what's going on in the life of Ezekiel, we get this sense because the kingdom of Israel and Judah. Israel's the northern part of Israel. Judah is Jerusalem in the southern part of Israel. Because of everything that had gone on there, and the people had basically walked away from Yahweh, Jehovah God, the creator, sustainer. They walked away from him and, okay, your decision, you're going to go on vacation for 70 years. Except it's not going to be a vacation, you're going to be slaves. And you're going to have to do everything that this Babylonian king says you got to do. And off they go. Jerusalem was God's holy city. And we'll hear more about that in these chapters to come. But here we find Ezekiel, this 30-year-old young man who now has been put in a position where he has to start to change people's attitude and their minds about eternal things with Yahweh. One of the things that he sees, first of all, in verses 3 and 4 of this opening chapter, is this storm. A vision came to him in the form of a storm. How do we understand that? Chapter 1, verse 2. On the 5th of the month, in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel. This is like he got a text. Hey, Zeke, this is God. Okay? And here's what we want you to know. So it comes expressly to Ezekiel, the priest, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kebar, and there the hand of the Lord came upon him. Wow. Think about that. You're sitting on the bank of the river and you're just like enjoying the sunshine. Life is good. You did your priestly duties, and all of a sudden you get this text from God, and it says, hey, there's a storm coming. As I looked, Behold, a storm wind was coming from the north. Who could that be? A great cloud with fire flashing forth continually and a bright light around it, and in its midst something like glowing metal in the midst of the fire. Woo! He's interceding with all these people around him that were captives, just like him, sitting on the banks of the river. And here he is, and all of a sudden, he starts to see this thing. Wow, it's all swirling around. It's hard to think of a picture in words to describe what that might be. In its midst was something like glowing metal in the midst of the fire. That would be like the iron worker who had the sword in the fire pit, and it gets glowing red, then white, and then he hammers it and shapes it. Here he's seeing something glowing like metal in the midst of the fire. Well, Isaiah, in the 6th chapter, verse 1, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted. So here all of a sudden we're seeing Ezekiel get this text from God. Similarly, the way that Isaiah got his. In the midst of this, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. In Acts 13, this is the history of the church. Now there were at Antioch, which was been in Syria, there were in Antioch, in a church that was there, prophets and teachers, Barnabas and Simeon, who was called Niger, and Lucius, and Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were ministering to the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work. Whoa. Out of nowhere, they receive a text. And it says, guess what? You're special. Barnabas and Saul. And they had this challenge put before them. Verse 3, then when they had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them, this is all the disciples, they've gathered around, and they've got Saul and Barnabas there, sent them away. They became all the people who were responsible for getting the word to the Gentiles. Whoa, that was a different place to be. Up until this point, there had been no interaction between the Jewish people and the Gentiles. It was verboten. It was forbidden. It wasn't going to happen. Similarly, when we get to Jeremiah, in the opening chapter, I'm going to drop down to verse 14. The Lord said to me, meaning to Jeremiah, out of the north the evil will break forth on all the inhabitants of the land. I think we heard that somewhere before, didn't we? As in like Ezekiel's call, the storm out of the north. The reality for what's going on at this time is that when the prophets would have these visions, and all of a sudden there is this, to them, visible communication. You could have been sitting right beside them and you wouldn't have had a clue. But in their mind's eye, they see this happening. Storm, lightning, fire, thunder, all of this is rolling, and it's headed where? It's headed to Jerusalem. It's going down there. Out of the north, the evil will break forth on all the inhabitants of the land. And the land here he's talking about it would be Israel. For behold, I am calling all the families of the kingdoms of the north, declares the Lord, and they will come and they will set each one his throne at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem and against all its walls round about and against all the cities of Judah. So just think about this for a moment. Here's in this particular case, this is a picture of the siege of Jerusalem, and it's going to get really, really bad. We're going to learn about that here in the future text. But the fact of the matter is, all of a sudden this is going on, and verse 16, I will pronounce my judgments on them concerning all their wickedness, which they have forsaken me, and have offered sacrifices to other gods and worshiped the works of their own hands. He's talking about the Hebrews, because eventually what happened in Jerusalem was in this beautiful temple that was built as God's house, they started to bring in small g gods. They're carving statues, and they're putting them in the holy places. And boy, did God get upset. Yeah, this is my house. It would be like somebody in your neighborhood coming into your house and taking down a picture of Jesus and, put up something else and say, we're going to worship this. The God of lawn cutting. Or the God of today, snow blowing. And that would be exactly what's going on here, because the reality for the day was that things are going to be changing in a bad way, and this is what's going to happen to you people. Shape up. And they're like, yeah. Don't want to hear it. Throughout the Bible, the Lord uses familiar talk, familiar verbiage to illustrate the spiritual truths that are going to take place. I mean, when he tells the Hebrews, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed and all this kind of stuff, they're like, yeah, sure, right. The walls are 30 feet thick. Good luck. I'm God. You're not. And it's going to happen. And what happens interestingly here with Ezekiel is a pretty cool thing. It has to do with a picture of the cherubim. The cherubim. We all have in our mind's eye, we have pictures of what the cherubim might be. Usually it's at Valentine's, and you see these little chubby angel guys with that bow and arrow, and they're going to pierce your heart with love. Cherubims aren't quite exactly like that. Ezekiel 1, and starting at verse 5, within it there were figures resembling 4 living beings. Living beings. It's a word play on the Hebrew that has to do with angelic figures, living beings. Because angels were this special part of God's creation that look like us, talk like us, act like us. They were living beings. Except these are a little bit different. And this was their appearance. Here they had human form, but, verse 6, each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Ooh, that's different. Their legs were straight and their feet were like a calf's hoof. That meant split hoof. They gleamed like burnished bronze, and their wings, there were 4 sides with human hands. So this description of these living beings is not like the little guy with the bow and arrow on Valentine's Day. This is a different folk. As for the form of their faces, each had the face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right, and a face of a bull on the left. And all 4 had the face of an eagle. Holy moly. How would you like to see that thing? That would have got my attention. I'd like to see what the eagle face looked like. Whatever was like the Philadelphia Eagles mascot, Verse 13, in the midst of the living beings, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire. There we go with that fire again. And it went back and forth among the living beings. The fire was bright and lightning was flashing from the fire, and the living beings ran to and fro like bolts of lightning. Can't you see these little fat chubby guys with their bow and arrow running around with fire and brimstone and all this lightning? Whoa! Genesis 3, this is where we really get the first indication of a cherubim. When Adam and Eve had sinned, and the Lord said, shame on you, you're out of here. So he drove the man out, meaning Adam and Eve, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. It was so they could never, ever, ever get back in there. Remember the tree of life? Don't eat that apple. Why? Bad things will happen. Okay. Now I know what a bad thing is. They didn't know what a bad thing was until then. So that's one vision he has here. He has a picture of the cherubim. Then how about the 4 wheels? Wheels are a big part of what's going on in this vision of his. From verse 15 through 21, there's four wheels. Now, as I looked at the living beings, behold, there was one wheel on the earth beside the living beings, and each one of them had four of them, and each had four of them. The appearance of the wheels and their workmanship was like sparkling beryl. That's a rare, valuable gem. And all four of them had the same form, their appearance and workmanship being as if one wheel. So he's got this vision that God's giving him. And one wheel physically looks like four wheels. I don't know how it works. I wasn't there. I tried to get a hold of Ezekiel and he wouldn't answer. So the reality for what's going on here is he has this picture in his mind of what's going on. Verse 18, as for their rims, they were lofty and awesome, and the rims of all four of them were full of eyes round about. Now it's getting spooky. These wheels had eyeballs all around them, looking around. Whenever the living beings moved, the wheels moved with them. Oh, so the cherubim are going for a walk, and right beside them are these wheels full of eyes. I don't know where this comes from. Wherever the living beings rose from the earth, the wheels rose also. Wherever the Spirit was about to go, they would go in that direction. And the wheels rose close behind them. So you're kind of getting the picture here that the cherubim and the wheels are like tied together. And they've got this association that they are trying to explain. This arresting picture of God's providence and how it impacts everybody. The reality is that the designs that God gave to humanity have never changed. God created man and woman in his own image. That's never changed. And what he wants the people to understand here in this awesome vision that Ezekiel's having is the fact that it doesn't matter what God does. All of these things are going to happen, and guess what? You're going to stay the same. But you need to worship me. You need to know who I am. And that creates another thing, and that's the look at the firmament. What's the firmament? What's the firmament? Well, it's this, as he would describe to us, an expanse that is over top of the cherubim and now the wheels. It's kind of like encased them, all of us and them. Ezekiel 1:22, now over the heads of the living beings there was something like an expanse, like the awesome gleam of crystal spread out over their heads, and under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward the other. Each one also had two wings covering his body on the one side and on the other. I also heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of abundant waters as they went, like the voice of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army camp. Whenever they stood still, they dropped their wings, and there came a voice from above called from the expanse that was over their heads whenever they stood still. All of this is to say, God has put this in the vision, this covering that would be a duplication of the sky, yet it was encasing all of this. The cherubim and the wheels and the prophet and all of the people that he was talking to and about are underneath of it. And the reality for what it was this, all of these noises started to take place because God was in action. And verse 13, and I heard the sound of the wings of the living beings touching one another, and the sound of the wheels beside them, even a great rumbling sound. It would be like thunder on steroids. Wow. So loud and crazy. And what happens when all this has occurred? Well, the wheels depicted God's omniscience, his omnipresence. God's all-seeing, all-knowing, all places at all time. And here we see in verse 26, his throne. The throne of authority. And this is a significant part of what goes on in the life of Ezekiel, because the glory of the Lord is here. Verse 26, now above the expanse that was over their heads, there was something resembling a throne like lapis lazuli in appearance. And on that which resembled a throne, high up was a figure with the appearance of a man. Then I noticed the appearance of his loins and upward, something like, here we go again, glowing metal that looked like fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his loins and downward, I saw something like fire, and there was a radiance around him, as the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so is the appearance of his surrounding radiance. This is a part of that where you find it's hard to describe something with words that humans understand. I mean, how do you describe all this stuff? Well, it's kind of like a rainbow with fire and brimstone and shiny stuff. What did it really look like? Well, I don't know. That's the best I can offer. Poor Ezekiel. The appearance, the surrounding radiance. And when I saw it, I fell on my face. Went prostrate in a worshipful mood. And I heard a voice speaking. And it takes us to Romans 11, where Paul said, oh, the depth and riches both of wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments. That means you can't describe them. You can't figure them out. And how unfathomable are his ways. Beyond comprehension or understanding. Unfathomable. God is so great and so powerful, we just don't have words. And here's Ezekiel's challenge, is to take those words and apply them to the people in captivity and say, God's talking to you, and if you don't shape up, it's going to get worse. Here's what's going to happen. That brings us to the reality that everything involved in this message that God gave Ezekiel to preach was basically because of the opposition that came from the people. He was this prophet, and he was in danger. The people didn't like him. He was going to be encouraged, and he was going to be strengthened because God continued to give him this information. And he saw God on the throne. Wow. That's pretty crazy. Being able to see God. And that meant, basically, he saw the mighty glory of God, Jehovah. And he'll continue to enlighten us from there. So, we're through chapter 1. We're going to conclude with this verse, book, chapter, verse, text. Ready? Ezekiel 1:28b. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard a voice speaking. Prophets. They were a brave lot, and many of them didn't make it to the finish line because they were so hated and despised. But the reality for Ezekiel, we find a great picture coming up in these next several chapters that describe exactly what will happen and then verifiably what did happen. More to follow.